ladies and gentlemen. Let's start this thing. We got a whole lot of ground to cover. And having missed last week didn't help any. So we are doing this overview of the Bible. That's going to be the next week or so, next couple of weeks. And then the following couple of weeks, we're going to do some case studies to sort of learn the habits of interpretation and discussion together as we look at some controversial passages and see how they've been interpreted by different people over the years. So we'll get to those case studies and creative discussion together later. But for now, Steph and I are just trying to present this overview of the Bible. I do hope you could watch them online if you missed the first couple. The first week was a bit about our passion for the Word and the living Word and Christ as the Word that the Bible testifies us to, how we have to read it in the power of the Spirit, this Timothy 3:16 text about everything being God-breathed. And then we began looking at Genesis, the origin story of us all, that we're made in God's image and that the world is good. And then in Genesis 3, it has that curious passage that after the snake has brought wreck and ruin to the whole creation, and we've seen paradise lost, that someone's going to come and be wounded by that snake, but will finally crush him. And of course, that's an allusion to Jesus Christ in Genesis 3 already. And some scholars have said the whole rest of the Bible is a footnote on that passage. How the whole rest of the Bible is the outworking of God through history to finally bring us through kings and prophets and exile and expectation to the person of Jesus and the resurrection power that defeats the devil, and then the giving of the Spirit that allows us to live it. So we looked at that kind of emphasis that if you're going to look at, Stephanie did a great little slide on cultural background and literary context that we always need, but we said one of the key contexts that we always have to look at when we're looking at the Bible is to understand its place in the unfolding drama. Like a Shakespeare play, we looked at several acts of the drama, creation and fall and covenant and promise and deliverance, and these different kind of flows that the Bible is a coherent story. I use the analogy sometimes of like a pearls, and we're looking not just at the little individual pearls, but we look at the string that holds it all together. And so this coherent unfolding drama is the big picture that we're going to try to do the next couple of weeks. We started with Stephanie doing a great introduction to the Pentateuch. We looked at a video from the Bible Project about how the Old Testament Jews in the Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible, have a different order in the Old Testament, and they view the history texts that we're going to look at just a little bit quickly today as prophecy. That's just fascinating to me, that the reporters telling the unfolding drama are not just historians like we would call them in our lingo. There's the books of wisdom, and there's the books of the gospel, and there's the books of history, Chronicles and Samuel and Kings and stuff. In the Tanakh, they're considered prophets because they're telling not what's going to happen in the future, but what God is doing in our midst. And so history is not like the Western tradition of journalism where we expertly and objectively report what happened, but it's prophecy where the unfolding drama is being pushed along page by page by page. So anyway, we're going to look a little bit at the history text. You may recall that after this sort of overview of Genesis, we looked at Deuteronomy and Leviticus and creation of God's law, their wandering in Exodus and so forth. Steph did a good job on that. Here is how Eugene Peterson, there's a little book that has an introduction to every book of the Bible. It's drawn from his paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. And in The Message, there's introductions to each book of the Bible, and they're great. Well, they took those introductions to every book of the Bible, put them out in one little book. I encourage the publisher to do this, and they listen to me. So here's this little book, and it's going out of print because nobody's buying it. But here's what Eugene Peterson says about the history books. He says the 12 books of the Bible, let me skip that, I'll jump to this. For biblical people, God is not an idea for philosophers to discuss or for priests to manipulate. God is not a part of creation that can be studied and observed and managed. God is a person a person to be worshipped and deified, believed or rejected, loved or hated in time and place. That is why these historical books immerse us in dates and events, in persons and circumstances, in real history. God meets us in the ordinary and extraordinary occurrences that make up the stuff of our daily lives. It never seemed to have occurred to our biblical ancestors that they could deal with God better by escaping from history, getting away from it all and retreat, as we say. History is the medium in which God works salvation, just as paint and canvas is the medium in which Rembrandt makes works of art. We cannot get closer to God by distancing ourselves from the mess of history. This deeply pervasive sense of history, the dignity of their place in history, the presence of God in history, accounts for the way in which the Hebrew people talked and wrote. They did not, as was the fashion in the ancient world, make up and embellish fanciful stories. Their writings did not entertain or explain. They revealed the ways of God with men and women in the world. They gave narrative shape. Remember we talked about narrative, storied shape to actual people and circumstances in their dealings with God and with God's dealing with them. But for the Hebrews, there is simply no secular history. None. Everything that happened was happening in a world penetrated by God. Since they do not talk a lot about God in their storytelling, it's easy to forget that God is always the invisible and mostly silent present in everything taking place. But if we forget that for very long, we will understand neither what is written nor the way it's written. God is never absent from these narratives and never peripheral to them. As far as these writers were concerned, the only reason for paying attention to people and kings and events was to stay alert to God. He says this is a difficult mindset for us to acquire. We are used to getting our history from so-called historians, scholars, and journalists for whom God is not even seen as involved or present. We are thoroughly trained to read history solely in terms of politics and economics, human interest, and environmental conditions. If we have a mind for it, we can go ahead and fit God in somewhere. But the historical books, Joshua, Judges, up through Esther, are radically and refreshingly different. They pull us into a way of reading history that involves us and everyone around us in the participation of God. Isn't that a good introduction to the Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, Samuel, Chronicles? These historical things with all these names we can't even pronounce and places and dates. I get lost in it, and so I'm nervous to give a quick overview of this because I don't know this material as well as I know some of you do, and we don't have enough time. So I'm real nervous. So let's go to it. You know that when Stephanie led us through the wilderness wanderings and the covenant and stuff, they were right at the edge of the River Jordan, about to go into the land of Canaan, the promised land after 40 years in the wilderness. This is where the book of Joshua picks up. After Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy ends with them waiting by the river. Moses was going to lead them in just like he led them out through Exodus, through the parting of the Red Sea and all, and led them through God and covenant and promises and the Ten Commandments, and there they are. And curiously, the book of Genesis and Deuteronomy narrate the death of Moses, which is an indication that Moses didn't write it all. Some people think Moses wrote it. But it tells about his death because he doesn't make it. He gives the mantle to Joshua. Joshua was one of the spies that went in early on to case it out, came back and said, there's enemies there the size of, we're like grasshoppers, and they're like the size of giants. So Joshua, who's later known to be brave, is ready to go in. I heard Walter Brueggemann once, the Old Testament scholar, say it's almost like those scenes in the American gold rush or the land rush where the prairie schooners were all lined up in Nebraska, and then the government said, go to it, whatever you can get, it's your land, and they just all took off. They're all there ready, waiting, and there's like pages and pages of lectures to them, sermons to them, to remind them. And one of the key passages is when you get there to this land flowing with milk and honey, there's going to be some enemies there, but as you take that land, it's going to be great for you, and you're going to probably forget God. You're going to say to yourself, we got all this ourselves. And so there's this warning about middle class, upper middle class hubris, where the more stuff we get and the easier life we have in a land flowing with milk and honey, we're going to forget God. So don't forget God, it says. All right, so then Joshua goes in. You probably know the River Jordan is split. It's this sort of land bridge between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it was a very violent land. It was a pagan land. It was a screwy place. Land becomes very important to the rest of the story. Remember, the offspring of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there were 12 tribes. They were formerly slaves, and now they're set free, and now they're given land. And so they divide up the land into 12 categories. They make covenants with all of them. Joshua is called to do that. And as he goes into Jericho, there's an interesting scene. It's in Joshua 5, where an angel shows up. And they ask him, whose side are you on? The Canaanites in the fortress of Jericho? Jericho, by the way, probably wasn't a city. There's no women or children mentioned. It was a fortified military establishment. But they were going to mark around it, and so forth, 7 times. He says, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the Jericho Canaanites, or are you on our side? And you know what the angel says? I'm on nobody's side. I'm on God's side. Don't be thinking this is about you versus them. This is about God fulfilling his promises to create a land, to create a savior, to create a kingdom so that Jesus could come. So don't even be thinking like I'm on your side. I'm on God's side. That's an interesting story when you ask, whose side are you on? I'm not left or right. I'm on God's side. Well, anyway, that's the story in Joshua 5. I want to say a big parenthesis here that we're going to talk about later when we do our case studies. From here on out in the story, there's tons of violence. Jesus comes and doesn't seem to go for that. And if we know that the God of the Bible and the person of Jesus is a God of love and grace and mercy, you wonder what the heck is going on with some of these seeming commandments to wipe out children. We're going to talk about that later. I just want to say it now that that's a huge question, is the question of violence in the Bible, particularly in Joshua. I do want to say this, though. I'll just say this, and then we'll look at some of those texts later when we do our case studies. There was in ancient Mesopotamia and Assyria and these kind of places in the ancient Middle East, narratives that historians call them conquest narratives. And you can go, you look up the archaeologists, and they find literally scrolls describing the conquest narratives that certain Assyrians or whoever, how many people they killed. Or there weren't even that many people living there then. It's like trash talk. It was a common literary form to emphasize and overemphasize the bloody violence of your kings. And everybody would try to outdo the other. It's sort of like, I don't know, I don't want to bring Trump into it, but the exaggerations for how many people were in a crowd, it's just silly that they just start like trash talking and saying stuff that just isn't true. So it may be that much of the book of Joshua is this sort of satirical trash talking, some of the battle scenes. Like when Muhammad Ali, those of us who remember him, strong as a butterfly, he was just always yapping about himself. It was part of his shtick. There is certain literary commonalities in ancient Middle East during that particular early time about those kind of battle scenes that were hugely exaggerated of how awful they were. And so if the historians have found these documents called conquest narratives, this great exaggeration, it could be like a politician doing PAR, some sort of trash talking. And that literary device, Stephanie had told us we have to read literary devices, whether it's a genre of poetry or whatever. This could be a sort of satirical trash talking bit when they talk about how many people were killed in the battles. I don't know that. We'll talk about that later. But I just wanted to parenthetically say there's ways to kind of think about violence in the Old Testament that we got to struggle with, and there may be some answers to some of it. I don't know, but that's just part of it. It is a violent text. Well, after Joshua, it moves into Judges. They have these different judges for each of the 12 tribes, and it's just unrelieved mayhem. Like that commercial on TV, that guy that makes mayhem from the audience. It's just nothing but bad news. And the famous verse that said more than once, the people did what was right in their own eyes. I was driving here from Dallastown this morning, and some guy had his right turn signal on, and he turned left. And I thought, just like Judges, people do whatever the heck they want. They don't follow the law. They don't do anything right. It is just, and then at one point it says, the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so it's a demoralizing epic of all these judges. The last judge was Samson, and you know the whole Samson narrative, and that's part of that. After Judges, we get to Ruth. Now, Ruth is sort of put in there. You don't exactly know where it's happening and so forth, but it's fascinating, and we could do a whole class just on Ruth. When our Bible study on Wednesday night did it, we had a blast. There's so much in Ruth. Of course, she's gleaning, which is part of the Old Testament law that Stephanie didn't particularly talk about. She talked about Leviticus and Deuteronomy being about God and so forth. One of the things in the Old Testament law was how to treat the poor. And in an agricultural economy, they were instructed to only go through and gather as much corn or wheat or whatever the first time through, and anything that was left behind, they couldn't go back and do it twice. You had to leave it for the poor. You had to leave swaths of land right next to the edge of the road so that the travelers and the hobos could have it. In other words, there was no ultimate private property because of your property where you were supposed to leave it legally for the needs of the poor. Well, that's what they were doing in the book of Ruth. They're gleaning. Because she's an immigrant. She's a refugee from another country where there's a famine. And she falls in love she becomes a relationship with somebody who becomes a redeemer kinsman. Somebody that's like a Christ figure. There's Christ figures all throughout the Old Testament. And so this type of Christ, this grace to outsiders, this place of immigrants, and this notion of gleaning and justice and mercy, there's just so much in the book of Ruth, and it's just a sort of parable in itself. But then the real historical narrative picks up again in 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is about the year 1000 BC, maybe, more or less. There's 4 overarching characters in Samuel. Hannah, who is barren, just like Mother Sarah, and finally has a baby. Samuel, who was raised then by the priest Eli. Saul, who becomes the first king of Israel. And then David, who becomes the second king of Israel, the son of Jesse. The book of Samuel, Eugene Peterson points this out, was framed by prayer. 1 Samuel 1 into 1 Samuel 2 is the prayer of Hannah, and the end of 2 Samuel 22, so from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel, is finally another prayer of David. And so it's framed, again, this idea that the history and the reporting is not just secular facts about kings and data, but it's prophecy, like the Tanakh would say. The historians are framing everything by prayer to God. 1 Samuel 4 is the narrative where the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized God's presence. The word Ichabod is used. We've heard of Ichabod Crane. It means God is gone. It's a despairing, dark time. It was kind of stupid because they were using it like a token in battle, thinking if they took the Ark of the Covenant, they could win in battle. And then it gets captured, and then they wonder what the heck happened. It was sort of a whole thing. So the Ark goes into exile, which almost becomes a prophecy sort of the time when Israel themselves will go into exile later. So it is captured. Ichabod, Israel deserved what they got, but Yahweh saved them. This promise and mess up and deliverance is kind of much of the theme of Samuel and Kings, where things are good, God makes promises, they live into it, they screw up, God forgives them in either mercy or judgment and delivers them into the next stage of the scene. This is like Shakespeare. I mean, there's just tragic, incredible stuff here. You probably know it better than I do. Saul fails. He's consulting mediums and all kind of weird stuff. And so David is anointed as a king. You know that story? He goes out to David and he shows all his sons because he knows he's going to pick one of them to be the next king. And none of them seem to be the one that God has told him. And he's like, well, you do have one other son. He's the runt. He's out in the shepherd fields. Go get him. Puny kid David, the youngest of the sons, shows up. And he says, that's him. He gets anointed as king by God, but there already is a king, King Saul. This is what you might want to call a coup. Now, David waits patiently. He he's a musician, kills Goliath. He becomes a musician, and Saul is starting to go crazy. He has mental health problems, and he brings David in to play the harp for him, to soothe him. So David and King Saul have a relationship. King Saul's son, Jonathan, becomes David's best friend. So there's this huge relational stuff. Eventually, David even becomes a son-in-law. Saul gets mad because David's becoming popular as a war hero, and he doesn't like this upstart, even though he's been kind to him and is almost a part of the family. Throws his spear at him, tries to kill him a couple times, and finally it becomes clear that Saul is so wicked he can't be the king anymore. And in a very moving scene, takes his own life on the battlefield, falls on his own sword. He asks his sword bearer to kill him, and the guy can't do it, so he kills himself. And then David can be anointed a second time as the real regal king in the city of, he's from the city of Bethlehem, right? He moves the capital to a city that has become known as the city of David. Jerusalem, the city of peace. And he starts the capital city, Zion, some call it. Zion, Jerusalem, city of David, all the same place. And he creates a royal palace there. Now, you know all the kind of stuff that happens with Bathsheba and some really pretty funky stuff. We could look at the life of David for a whole year. He brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He's keenly interested in worship. Zion, the city of David, he dances wildly when it comes. Remember that scene? He doesn't even have his clothes on, and his wife is embarrassed. He's out dancing so much that his clothes fall off. He's enthusiastically committed to worship, but he cannot build a temple because God said you have too much blood on your hands from too many battles. And so it ends with the whole fiasco of him killing Uriah, who was Bathsheba's husband. You know, he was awful. And the prophet Nathan confronts him. Psalm 51, then he writes this terrible lament. Absalom, his own son, is killed. And God said David can't build the temple, which was his real heart's desire, to worship God. Well, that's how it leads then into 1st and 2nd Kings, which is about 500 years, about 40 different kings. I can't even say their names. Don't worry if you can't either. It is a relentless exposition of failure, one commentary says. Recall, God didn't even want them to have kings. Remember, we looked at that in our political class. They wanted to have kings so they could be like the other nations. And God's like, no, these judges things are going to be okay. Let's work out a jurisprudence justice system where I'm your king and we have regal judges. No, we want a real monarchy. So they have a monarchy. David's the king. Solomon then, his son, becomes the next king who begins to develop the temple. God uses them despite their foolishness and their utter uncooperation with the redemptive plan. God's sovereignty is a theme in 1st and 2nd Kings. There are a few bright lights. David, some of the time. Hezekiah is a name you'll remember. He was a good king. Josiah had reforms, trying to get rid of the idols and trying to restore some sense of righteousness in the priesthood and in the monarchy. Curiously, in the middle of Kings, you have prophets begin to show up. And it says guys like Jeremiah show up. Now, you don't know what he says till you read the book of Jeremiah later. That's the whole narrative of what he says. But he shows up in Kings. You know like a little bit about Jeremiah, because in the narrative, in the story, in the movie, he shows up and yells at the king and the priests and gets in trouble. That's about all you know. It's pretty dramatic. But if you want to know what he said in those sermons, you have to turn to Jeremiah. So see how the narrative is developing, the prophetic word and the oracles that these guys like Hosea and Isaiah had. We'll get to that later, but they were right happening during this time of Kings. Of course, there's a civil war. We've often talked about it, sort of like the American Civil War. The capital is Jerusalem, but then there's the other tribes, and the exile begins to get loomed as the prophets begin to warn and say, this is not going to go well. Well, in the middle of that, David, I said that he was a musician. He is an artist. Not only was he a king, he was a rock star, and he was a poet, and he was a man of prayer. So he wrote all these psalms in the middle of this. King Solomon, who built the temple, oppressing the poor and using exploited labor, it says, by the way, writes at the end of his life the book of Ecclesiastes. Is there any meaning to life even? We call this, in some other texts, the Lamentations, we call this the wisdom literature. And so the wisdom literature comes out in the middle of this historical stuff. And so I would like Steph to guide us a little bit into some of the poetry that emerged in the middle of this historical narrative. Are you with me so far? Is this making sense? A kind of overflow of the story flowing, the historical sense of God being involved, the kings, good ones and bad ones, his sovereignty, his mercy, his promise and deliverance, and the various kings, and the capital in Jerusalem. And now David, the poet, takes center stage.
Wow. I was expecting you were going to leave me with 5 minutes or something. This is unheard of. Any questions at this point before we go on to look at the books of poetry? One thing that just always a couple of things that always jump out to me as we read these books of the complicated history of Israel is, as you mentioned, how the prophets are constantly, speaking to the kings, saying, you are not living up to God's plan. You are not leading this country in the way that it should be led. And then the other thing that I'm always struck by is that there were some kings that were just comprehensively terrible. There were others that were more of a mixed bag. But even the ones that we think of as the heroic kings, like David and Solomon, very often were failures, very often did not live up to God's will, and were called out themselves by the prophets, by God. And so even the best of our human kings leaves us longing and waiting for a truly good king. And that I just think is such a striking part of this historical narrative, the sort of human failure that is all throughout all of these historical accounts. Even the leaders who the people put the most faith and trust and hope in still ended up not living up to expectations. And that we are still waiting for the truly good king who truly can bring about God's reign of love and peace and justice. Spoiler alert, we're going to get there. But yeah, so at this point in our collection of books in the Bible, we have this chunk of books that are sometimes called the poetic books, even though there is poetry in other parts of the Bible too. Sometimes referred to as the wisdom literature. And we start off with this really strange book of Job. And Job begins kind of almost like it's a fairy tale. It almost starts off like, once upon a time in a far-off land is kind of the first sentence of the book. And we get this story about this man named Job, who is, we are told, a good and faithful lover of God. We have this view sort of up in the heavens of God and God's advisors, and a character who is in some translations called Satan, in some translations called the adversary, basically says, hey God, you think Job loves you, but what if he's only pretending to love you so he can get good stuff from you? What happens if we take away all the good things in his life, make him suffer a lot? Will he still love you? And God says, you want to see what happens? Go for it. And so God gives this adversary permission to basically destroy everything in Job's life, killing everyone that he loves, taking away everything that he cares about. And this whole book then becomes a conversation between Job and some of his friends who are trying to make sense of, well, how do we understand God in the midst of this inexplicable suffering? It's a fascinating book. It's a complex book. But after all of these sort of, chapters and chapters of arguments, dialogues, back and forth between Job and his friends, trying to puzzle out, well, if God is really just, you must have sinned. Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe you're gonna sin in the future. All of these sort of, hypotheticals about how we can understand what happened. Job then, lashes out at God and says, I don't understand. I demand you come down here and talk to me and tell me what's going on. And God takes Job on this sort of tour of the cosmos and shows him all of the things that God has created, all of the sort of intricate parts of creation and how it works and how it holds together. And God basically says, have you done any of this? Can you understand how I made any of this? How on earth can you expect me to explain what I'm doing when you can't possibly comprehend? And God basically then says, Job's friends spoke falsely. They are not helpful guides in figuring out this problem of how we understand God's justice, but that Job is commended. Even though Job sort of is on this emotional roller coaster, sometimes praising God, sometimes, wishing he was never born and yelling at God, that God basically says, Job, you were right to bring this to me. And so we're kind of left in this very unsatisfying place, I feel, at the end of the book, of God never really explaining, well, here's the, reasoning by which all of these things happened. But we are left with this impression of human wisdom versus divine wisdom, and that God's wisdom is so beyond what humans can comprehend, that Job is left in this position of humility and of trust. And that kind of sets the stage for the rest of these books of wisdom. This contrast between the wisdom of humans, even our wisest humans like Solomon, and the wisdom of God, and that God's ways are so beyond human understanding, but that God seemed to welcome Job's conversation with God about it. So that's a really interesting introduction to this chunk of books known as the wisdom literature. Yeah, please.
This is really helpful that Job is the beginning of the wisdom literature, of the poets and the Psalms and stuff. I'm not exactly sure where Job fits in the narrative. We've said that the Bible is not chronological, and so Job is sort of the beginning of the wisdom literature. Is it fair to say that some people think that Job is a parable?
Yeah.
A real historical
It's fair to say that.
There's no date or anything with it. There's no kings mentioned.
Yeah, the story itself does not really place it in time in any particular place, and it kind of feels like that's intentional. Like it is meant to be this sort of timeless, epic parable that is equally relevant to all times and places. So yeah, it's not particularly set in any one era.
Like Ruth and Esther or Jonah, like we know where they fit in the plot. If you're a student, look at the kings and stuff, you can figure it out.
Yeah.
Job is just sort of there.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I feel like that's intentional by the writers. So then next in the Bible, we have the book of Psalms, which, as was just mentioned, approximately half of them are in some way associated with David. Could have been written by David, we know he was a musician, could have been inspired by the life of David, but have to do with David as a person of prayer. Then the other half are written by various other authors, some that we know, some that we don't, many of which did happen later on in history. And so the book of Psalms was then compiled by editors and put together. And we're going to watch in a couple of minutes a brief video that tells us a little bit more about what to look for when reading the book of Psalms. But before we get to that, I actually want to skip then to the next three books, which are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, sometimes called the Song of Songs. And those three books are associated with King Solomon, either based on material that he wrote or material that his students wrote, but are connected with him and with his wisdom that he was famous for. And so because we have to be quick here, I think the fastest way to get through these three books is we're going to watch a brief 5-minute video that shows us some things to look for when we're reading these books of Solomon. We'll let KG get that up and running for us. Thanks, KG. There we go.
Story of the Bible, King Solomon was the wisest ruler that Israel ever had.
And there are three books in the Hebrew Scriptures connected to him: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. They pass down the legacy of Solomon's wisdom, but in a surprising way.
So let's talk about how to read the books of Solomon.
Okay, to really appreciate the story of Solomon's wisdom, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden.
Where God created humanity, male and female.
Right, Adam and Eve. And God commissions them to rule the world together in intimacy and love.
Kings and queens
to learn wisdom from his successes and his failures.
Got it. So let's start with Proverbs.
Okay, so the book of Proverbs is most well known for the hundreds of short, memorable sayings that teach us how to live by God's wisdom.
Like, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't be wise in your own eyes.
In Proverbs, living by God's wisdom instead of your own is called the fear of the Lord. Like in the book's opening paragraph, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Now, Proverbs isn't just memorable sayings. It actually begins with a lot of poetry.
Yes, 9 chapters of speeches from Solomon to his royal sons. He tells them to pursue God's wisdom, which is symbolized as an elegant woman.
Wisdom is a woman.
Yes, so remember, in the Garden of Eden, the man and the woman's intimacy was violated by their failed search for wisdom. But now in Proverbs, humans who reunite with God's wisdom become what Adam and Eve failed to be, wise human rulers. Proverbs 3 even says that when we embrace Lady Wisdom, we're taking hold of the tree of life.
Now, we're the ones in the garden.
Exactly. Proverbs is saying that every day we all stand before the tree with our own choice to make. And Solomon urges us, choose wisdom and life.
Got it. So, how does Ecclesiastes fit into Solomon's story?
Well, in this book, it's like we're meeting Solomon near the end of his life, and he offers some sober reflections.
Life is hevel.
That's the Hebrew word for vapor or smoke, which is unpredictable and uncontrollable. And he's constantly talking about life under the sun. That is, life outside of the garden, how it's confusing and difficult.
Right, even when I live by God's wisdom, life can be full of disappointments.
Leading up to the ultimate disappointment, your own death.
That's depressing.
But at the end of the book, he says we should strive to live by wisdom and the fear of the Lord, just with more realistic expectations.
Got it. Well, maybe the next book will cheer us up. The Song of Songs, a love poem between a man and a woman, and it'll make you blush.
Yeah, on its basic level of meaning, this book is racy Hebrew love poetry. But remember, in Proverbs, humanity's pursuit of wisdom was portrayed with the symbolism of a man pursuing a woman in a garden.
But in this song, it's the woman who's searching and longing for her lover.
Yes, it's a poetic image of Lady Wisdom pursuing us so that we can have life. In fact, the song ends with a poem about how this lady's love is more powerful than death itself.
So the song works on two levels. It's celebrating humans' desire for intimacy,
And saying that that desire points to humanity's ultimate purpose, to be united with God and his wisdom.
so we can rule, united with each other.
Exactly. This is why the song ends with the man and the woman united in love under a fruit tree.
So the story of Solomon and these 3 books invite us to see ourselves within the whole biblical story.
Yes, they're about how God designed all of us to rule the world by his wisdom, so that we can all find true life.
So lots of really interesting ideas here. In the context of this story of the people of Israel that we've been talking about, when things are politically chaotic, when things are morally ambiguous, this clear call to rely on God's wisdom, even though it comes through fallible human writers inspired divinely by the Holy Spirit. I think it's a really interesting reflection on the way that human wisdom and God's wisdom are not the same thing, but how God's wisdom is pursuing us and calling us, even in the midst of really complex situations. Which brings us then to the book of Psalms, which is what our Wednesday night Bible study group is actually studying right now. And so if you're interested in digging into the Psalms more deeply, you are very welcome to join us any Wednesday night at 7 on Zoom. We would love to have you. We started at the beginning, and we are going through and just reading and discussing, and it's fascinating. But in general, as I said, the Psalms is a collection of poetry, many of which are prayers or songs for worship, many of which are associated with King David, but many of which also were written later or by other folks. And I'm going to play one more video that helps us, I think about the book of Psalms in the context of this broader biblical narrative. And it's going to give us some spoilers about what we're going to talk about next week, which is that as the kingdoms of Israel fell further and further into chaos, and there was a civil war, and the prophets are constantly calling out the kings for failure to obey the covenant, for failure to live up to God's laws, we then get to the exile, which we're going to talk about next time. And so this video talks about thinking about the Psalms in that context of the bigger picture. So let's take a look.
I didn't see this video yet, but I'm guessing it's going to say that some of the Psalms were written before the exile. So God is in his throne, everything is great, praise the Lord. Some of them are laments about the fall and sin and wickedness and being in exile. And then some are probably written after the exile, like, hey, praise the Lord again, we're now renewed. But a little more sober, a little more aware of what could have happened. So this creation fall redemption story, Psalms of goodness, Psalms of disarray and disorientation, and Psalms of reorientation is how some people group the Psalms. 3 different sorts, and maybe 3 different sort of eras in the midst of the story of the kings and the exiles. Or you could say David's own life, when he's really righteous, when he's really fallen, and when he's been renewed. So that creation, fall, redemption, orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. That's 3 ways to understand the 3 sorts of Psalms. Does that make sense? 3 different kinds of Psalms. You can group them all. Orientation, things are good. Disorientation, what the heck? Or reorientation. Oh, I get it. I hope that's what they say. And if they don't, they're wrong. This is the moment of disorientation.
We've been talking about poetry in the Bible, how biblical poets love design and masterfully use metaphor and symbolism. These poems invite us into an experience, to ponder ideas slowly and from many angles.
And the largest collection of poetry in the Bible is the book of Psalms. So that's what we're going to look at here.
Now, the Israelites composed lots of poetry throughout their history.
Yeah, poems were written by Israelite sages, kings, and prophets. Some poems were sung by choirs in the Jerusalem temple, while others were prayed by families at home. And over the centuries, the most important and widely read poems were compiled together to be read or sung on special occasions.
And I'm familiar with books of poetry, a large collection of the greatest poems in one place, and I can read through and pick my favorites.
But the book of Psalms isn't that kind of collection. Here, each poem has been expertly crafted and then placed where it is for a reason, to create a storyline from the book's beginning to its end. The Psalms poetically retell the entire biblical story, and they invite you into a literary temple.
A literary temple?
Yeah, so the tabernacle, and then later the temple in Jerusalem, were where ancient Israelites went to meet with God. When you arrived, you would see art and imagery everywhere. You'd see priests performing rituals, you'd hear songs and prayers, all of it symbolically proclaiming that your God rules the world from this mountain and you're in his living room.
So the temple was a place to be in God's presence, and also to immerse yourself in the story of God's kingdom.
Exactly. And so try to imagine how traumatic it was when the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, plundered and burned the temple, and then took many Israelites into exile.
Yeah, where can they go now to meet with God, sing their story, and say their prayers?
That's where the book of Psalms comes in. It's a prayer book for exiles, designed as a virtual temple. You enter the Psalms to meet with God and to hear the entire biblical story of God's kingdom sung back to you in poetry.
Cool, but how does the Psalms do it?
Let's start with the book's design. There are 150 poems broken up into 5 clear sections. At the beginning, there's been placed a short introduction, Psalms 1 and 2, which lay out the main themes of the whole book by reviewing the biblical storyline.
Okay.
Psalm 1 looks back to the Garden of Eden and its river of life.
Yeah, God placed humanity in a garden temple.
songs of praise are meant to become our own. They're poems for exiles who are learning to live by God's wisdom and to seek God's justice in the world as they hope for the coming Messiah and the kingdom of God.
Well, there we have it. A brief introduction to Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. This interesting chunk of poetic wisdom literature that we have.
Steph, can I ask real quick?
Yeah, please.
We refer to the songs as poems. We also know they're sung, and some of them they actually tell you what instruments to use to play them by. Are they prayers? Are they hymns? Are they poems?
There's a wide variety. Some of them are very clearly prayers or hymns.
Prayer.
Yeah. Some of them less clearly seem to be, or perhaps only include a small part that clearly seems to be prayer. But in general, a lot of them are. And the Book of Psalms has been treated as prayer by the church. So even the ones that don't clearly seem to be saying things like, "Oh God, I love you, oh God, please help me," have traditionally been, by both Jews and Christians, read in a posture of prayer. And were in fact, prayers that Jesus prayed, and in fact quotes from during his life that we read about in the Gospels. So some of them might have been written for particular occasions, like, the coronation of a king, for example. But all of them, I think, can be thought of as literature to be prayed.
There's a New Testament text where they talk about singing spiritual songs and psalms.
Yeah.
So we know from that in the early church they sang these sort of as their hymn book. Now, for what it's worth, and I'm sure most of you probably know this, but many Presbyterian traditions from Scotland, the Calvinists before they came to the United States, only sang the Psalms in their worship services. And there are a few Presbyterian churches, like the Reformed Presbyterians, RPCA, that are our sister denominations, and that's all they sing. So when you go to worship and you open their hymn book, it's the same tunes we would know, Mighty Fortress is Our God or something, but it's the songs that they put into poetic form as hymns, and they only sing the Psalter. And so calling it the hymn book of the church is quite true in the Presbyterian tradition. And for some of us, and we PCUSA Presbyterians have a Psalter as well. We don't use it in our church, but they've created it as a hymnal that has hymn tunes and nothing but the Psalms.
Yeah.
And so this has been through church history used, chanted, sung, liturgically, communally in worship, besides just us reading it devotionally on our own.
Yep,
It's
absolutely.
sung and prayed in worship.
And they've been put to music of every imaginable style from every imaginable era.
And nowadays, pop singers are doing like praise and worship, contemporary stuff, are doing really cool renditions of the songs. You can buy whole albums of the songs.
Yeah.
They're pretty neat.
So, here we are with this poetry and wisdom literature to ponder as things are in this story that we've been looking at getting really complex and really bad. And we're going to see what sort of catastrophe awaits us next week as we continue on with this story.
Hey, I'll say one thing. Can I say one more thing? I didn't flip my page and finish my notes. The literature of the kings and stuff ends with chronicles. I did this on purpose, actually. Chronicles retells the story of kings, but it's written after the exile. So we got Samuel and David and Saul and the kings and the good kings and the bad kings. Then the wisdom literature. Chronicles is just right in there, but chronologically speaking, it wasn't written till later. Well, which is